Hey there, I'm Rick Clemons, and I am an out entrepreneur who has the beautiful life of being a podcaster, a speaker, and a guy who helps men truly step into their masculinity, regardless of what their gender or their sexual orientation is.
Hello, Out Bosses. Rhodes Perry here, and welcome to this week's episode of The Out Entrepreneur, a weekly podcast where I get to interview today's most inspiring LGBTQ bosses crushing it in business. On this week's episode, we are welcoming back friend of the show, Rick Clemons. As many of you know, Rick was first interviewed on episode 25, going way back into the archives of The Out Entrepreneur. And he's calling all the way from sunny California. So, Rick, I think you're bringing the sun to Portland right now. So thank you for that. Are you ready to inspire fellow Out Bosses?
Totally. Let's
Awesome.
do this, man.
All right. Yes. Okay. So just a little bit about Rick. If you haven't listened to episode 25, this is a little bit about who he is. So he is a well-known culture disruptor in a good way, a closet buster, and a badass bold move strategist. Tapping into his 25 years experience in hospitality, technology, branding, marketing, and personal development, he's created a no BS approach for success. Live your truth with no apologies. I love that. And as a result, individuals, teams, and organizations embrace his approach, busting out of their suffocating closets to make the bold moves. Rick is also an amazing podcaster. He has over 350 under his belt. So this really super excited to have you back on the show. You know, since it's been a while since we last connected, I'm really interested in digging into talking a little bit more about how your business has evolved since, almost 2 years since we last chatted. You know, talking a little bit about what you're doing as a speaker and author, and then jumping into the topic of healthy masculinity. So if you're down,
Sure.
why don't we kick off and talk a little bit about podcasting? And when you were first on the show, you were the host of the Coming Out Lounge, which has, you've kind of shifted both the branding of the show and the name, which is now called Life Uncloseted. So I'm curious, could you walk us through that process of why you decided to kind of change the branding of the show and evolve it in the way that you have?
Sure. So one of the things that I found about being a podcaster right out the gate when I started doing it was part of me stepping into really being who I was, using my voice. And I never realized the power of my voice until I did get behind the microphone. And ironically, today I'm actually, in just a couple hours, I'm going to go step behind the microphone and record some voiceover work for a local radio station for some ads. And it's so interesting to see how this has evolved because I always came from it from the space of my voice and the stories and all that sort of stuff. And then as soon as I started podcasting, I saw the impact and I saw the beauty of people being able to listen to a podcast and have that connection to something that they may not want other people to know that they're listening to, and getting advice and feeling like they belong. And as the Coming Out Lounge continued to grow and we got more listeners and I started to see the numbers, catapult that people were downloading, I was like, this is an amazing journey. But simultaneously, in my coaching practice and in the work I was doing and the kind of speaking I was doing, I saw a shift starting to happen. That this just wasn't about me being an LGBTQ guy speaking and coaching people out of the closet. I suddenly started to connect dots that, wow, there are closets everywhere in everybody's lives. And it could be a closet in a corporate organization. It could be a closet in a relationship that's not to do with coming out of the closet about being gay or bi or any of that stuff. And I connect those dots and I thought, oh, wow, I should, create a new podcast. And then I thought that's kind of silly. I already have it. I already have the basis of a really good podcast. Come up with something that kind of becomes the umbrella. And simultaneously in my business roads, I was starting to see this on a lot of fronts because I was starting to realize, wow, I can take what I speak on and pivot it very easily. In fact, I was speaking at a college, and in the moment, which is something I feel like I'm pretty good at, is tap dancing in the moment. I realized the students were kind of engaged, but I was losing them, and it happened to be one of those like 7 to 10 o'clock at night classes, and I hated those when I was in college. And I thought, okay, I got to do something to wake this crowd up. And I said, you know what, here's the thing. You may not be gay, straight, or bi, or any of those labels. You may not be transgender, but I want you guys to play with me here for just a minute. And I had them close their eyes and put their head down on their desk. Of course, I took the risk that they would fall asleep, but I thought, you know what, I'm going with. And I said, how many of you right here tonight are in this university studying something that you really didn't want to do, but you're doing it because somebody else told you this is who you're supposed to be? Or you're pursuing it because you want to please somebody else, or you're doing it just because, you know what, maybe I can figure myself out by doing this. Amazingly, over 60% of students raised their hands.
Yeah.
And it was that moment I really started to see, wait, I've got something here beyond the beautiful work I'm already getting to do and blessed to do with helping people late in life come out of the closet. I started to see, wow, I can take this other places. And that was the genesis of stepping it forward into life uncloseted.
I love what you just shared, and I think the start for you, of just showing up consistently and sharing what you know from your lived experiences, starting out with the coming out closet. With the podcast itself, did you have the book already written, Frankly, My Dear, I'm Gay, or did that kind of come along with the podcasting?
It came along, well, actually, it was being written at the same time that the podcast was starting to gain momentum.
Yeah.
Podcast came first, and then I kind of knew, hey, something's inside me, and even right now as we sit here, there's something inside me, and I've got another book I'm starting to work on, and you can feel it. You can feel it when you're being pulled. I know you as a new author, you get this, man. You're being pulled to do this.
Yes.
So simultaneously, I'm starting to watch the Coming Out Lounge catapult, and so it was a nice, collaboration between two different products in my business.
Yeah, and so the reason why I asked that question is, and I think it relates to what you originally were saying, you found the power of your voice, you're showing up, you're having these really interesting conversations with other folks who've been in the closet, trying to confront the closet, starting out in LGBT space. And from that, you produce this really phenomenal content that you get instant confirmation, right? You get instant confirmation through those downloads, and that's always really nice to see when they increase, right? And I just think that that's really inspiring that you've continued with that journey and you've trusted your intuition where just like in that classroom, you had to kind of, tap dance a little bit to say, this is bigger than LGBT space. While certainly the coming out process, which happens again and again, is a pretty unique experience for us when it comes to our sexual orientation and gender identity, right? And yet, like you're right. I mean, there's lots of people for so many different reasons that have shame or feel vulnerable about certain experiences in their life that aren't shared by other people, and they're not necessarily LGBT, and they also have a closet that they have to confront and come out, and who better to help with that than the coming out coach, So I think that that's really, really powerful and really helpful for business owners who listen to this podcast, and are looking for advice of what the next great idea is for their business or where to go next. And I think maybe a learning lesson from you and from folks like me and other podcast hosts is just, whatever your medium is. Maybe it's not, hearing your voice across the internet through podcasting. Maybe it's writing, or maybe it's speaking, or whatever that might be. But just to continue to show up and start creating the content, even if it doesn't feel like it's the most profound statement ever. The fact that you're willing to show up and perfect this craft is really, it's impressive, to see this kind of commitment, especially 350 episodes, which I don't even know how many years that involved, but you're doing it and you're clearly having a big impact. So, with these kind of 350 episodes, what have you learned through podcasting that has helped you in your business?
The biggest thing I think I've learned is I dialed into something that I didn't know was really part of my greatest assets, which is my voice. And I know that sounds kind of like, okay, this guy's really focused on his voice, but I don't mean like what you're hearing right now. What I'm talking about is my voice and my perspective, because everything that brings me the most success is anytime I'm sharing my voice, whether it's literally sharing it on my podcast or on another podcast like today, whether it's something I write for the Goodman Project or Huffington Post or whomever I write for. It's my voice. It's my perspective. It's how I show up on videos or on stage. It's all about my voice. And when I put those things all together, it's like, oh my God, Rick, this is right here in front of you all along. When I think about how I was as a kid and what I tried to do through college, and even as I got into my work environment, everything was about me using my voice and also recognizing that at times my voice was not being heard. So the uncloseting piece of this it's very interesting because my overall theme in my business is make your bold move, live life on your terms. Well, part of that is uncloseting whatever you need to do to live life on your terms. And I realized about 3 years ago, I had to uncloset myself into owning that I have a voice. I don't have a voice for everybody, but I have a voice. And a lot of people appreciate the voice I bring, the perspectives I look at, the things that I uncover. I mean, just yesterday, I was actually with a group of engineers from the company, which is so not the kind of thing I normally would be doing. But I got an opportunity to do an adventure, which is part of my bold move stuff, and it was a bold move team building adventure. And I took them out into some of the hills here locally. There's a beautiful park where we did some experiences, and I watched these engineers come out of their closets. And the reason it happened was because I learned from doing my podcast that it not only was it my voice, because people have said you have a great radio voice, which I now use, but I also have a voice because of the things I bring up, the things I go explore, the raw truth that I'm not afraid to, like, let's go in here, even if it feels taboo. That's the biggest thing I've learned from being a podcaster is I have a voice, and it's not just the sound of my voice.
Yeah, I think that that's really powerful. And it's, I know just having recently gone through writing a book, I'm in this space, I do equity and inclusion work, and there's so many other books out there on the topic, and I think sometimes whether you're podcasting, writing a book, speaking, especially when it's kind of well-tread ground where you're like, why me? The imposter syndrome pops up. And I think your response to this question is really important to remember for our listeners, where it's like, sure, other people may have said similar things, but they haven't lived your experiences, right? And so your kind of lens, the things that you bring to the table, no one else can bring that because you have this whole unique journey that no one else has. It's that reminder when you continue to create content and how people respond to it. So these engineers may have never thought about closets before, like they're crunching numbers, they're doing the thing that they need to do. And you're asking these tough questions that allow them to have some introspective moments they can reflect. And what pops up is they're able to be vulnerable, share with their colleagues. And, that creates real connections. That creates that kind of the secret sauce of team morale and, the things that most HR managers are striving to create for their teams. But it's not until I think people from the outside like yourself and others kind of come in and disrupt whatever those cultural norms are to get people to start thinking and connect in different ways that aren't necessarily around specifically their job functions every day. So I think that that's really powerful work that you're doing. 350 podcast shows, that's a lot, especially even, I imagine for every guest, and I remember talking to you when I was first getting started in podcasting where I'm like, okay, so you have these questions, do you stick to them? And you're like, at some point I just got rid of all of the questions, and you just kind of show up for your guest and you're in the moment. But kind of more broadly, over that course of time, did you ever feel like you were running out of things to say, or you just, where did you get the stamina? Where did you get the energy to keep going? I guess that's what I'm trying to ask.
I think it comes from being curious. I go into even this conversation today, I came into it like, okay, I'm curious where we'll go, what might come up, what might we explore. Sure, I know some about my guests before they come on because I asked for their bio. I didn't just like, oh, you sound like you'd be a good guest because I met you, standing on the street corner. No, there's something that will intrigue me about a person, and then I'll go into it. So a good example is I'm recording a show on Monday, and the guy I'm recording with, he actually used to be a speechwriter for Bill Clinton. Now, some people might go, okay, well, what does that have to do with Life Uncloseted? Well, there's a whole story behind how he moved from being a speechwriter in the Clinton era to kind of moving through politics to now he's actually a guy who helps entrepreneurs really define their business. So there's a whole bold move, uncloseting story. And I know the guy kind of, we've had some interaction throughout the years. But what I love is the mystery of what might happen in that moment. And it's not for everybody. One of the things I know, again, that I'm really good at is dancing in the moment. As soon as I hear something, I'm like, okay, let's go from there. Now, it may move past that, and I'll go, okay, that's okay, but I'll find a way to, like, work it back in. But it's truly about curiosity and knowing that I haven't told all the stories yet.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many stories that can be told and so many things that I can learn. And that if I'm still learning, that means someone else is still learning as well.
Yeah. And I think that your curiosity combined with your ability to really listen and remember makes for really good podcasting. You're definitely a host that I look up to, and it's fun just to kind of hear how you kind of weave, these, and knowing too on the back end, that you really are just showing up and asking questions. It's not like, I mean, you've done the research, you've read a little bit about them, but it's not necessarily like you're walking in with a script. And I think that takes a lot of skill, especially as for myself as kind of a type A Virgo, I'm like, I need to know where I'm going. I need to have a plan. So it's a cool process to see you do that.
But it's interesting that you bring that up, Rhodes, because I live my life kind of that way. And people are going to go, wow, this guy, okay, he lived his life just kind of like, okay, I don't know where I'm going. I do know where I'm going, but I'm also very open to, I have a plan, but I'm also really willing to, like, let's just be in the moment. And back to the engineers, I had to be in the moment yesterday because one of the engineers I knew was showing up with a foot injury. He was in a surgical boot. I had no clue when he showed up how bad it was. And we were going to go hike this, go hike up into this area, not a huge hike for most of us who hike. And so then we ended up driving up to the beginning of where this property is rather than hiking up the road we would have gone to. I thought, cool, I'm going to get in that far and then we'll be fine. Well, we get up there and he couldn't even go much beyond where the van was. So in that moment, I had to get really curious with myself. I had to be ready to, like, dance in that moment and figure it out because I was the facilitator of this thing. I was getting paid some really good money for a 3-hour thing here. And I had to go, okay, what do I need to do? How can I show up? What can I bring to this now that I can incorporate into this? Because I just got thrown in a closet and I had to make a bold move to figure out how to do this. And so this is how I kind of live life. I guess it's the DNA that I got handed, like, okay, just go with it. Just be there.
Yeah, well, it reminds me of just kind of, I'm big into meditation, and it's this idea, it's like the bow, where, like, you can't be too rigid, and having the plan and sticking to it and controlling everything, and you also can't be too loose, but you've got to find that middle ground, and it sounds like it's an active practice, and you're comfortable with just seeing how it's flexing, right, and adjusting.
And I don't want anybody to think I'm, like, so good at this because. At any given moment, I can be like, no, it has to be done this way. This has to happen this way. Yep. And then there's that side of me that shows up too. But,
totally.
I think the lessons that I've learned from coming out of the closet is as much as you plan and as much as you prepare, it's never going to be what you think. And that doesn't mean it's going to be negative. It doesn't mean it's going to be positive. It's just be ready to know no matter what that closet is you're coming out of, as a business owner, as someone in a relationship, you can have all the preparation in the world, but be ready to just literally be in the moment and see where it takes you.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think kind of zooming out for business owners, that is really good advice, just to show up every day and be open and be curious, because I think that's where a lot of the magic does happen. So one more question for you, Rick, on just kind of the podcasting side. And this is just me being curious. Is there a particular podcast guest that you've had or a topic that has come up that really stands out? I mean, 350 episodes is a lot, but I'm just curious, like, is there one or two where you're just like, whoa, my mind was blown, or I really learned something new and it changed the way that I think about myself or my business?
There's a couple that come up. One was with a guy by the name of Lance Navarro, who's a sex worker. And I don't have any qualms about going into that space. But I found it so fascinating to just truly be in that area and knowing that some of the stuff we were going to be talking about was going to tune some people out, and some of the stuff was really going to draw people in. And it was amazing to see that has been, sex sells, so to speak, but that has been one of the most downloaded podcasts in recent times.
Yeah.
The most recent one that just happened was, and it hasn't aired yet, was with someone that I got connected through other people. Her name is Laura Otting, and her book's coming out called Limitless. And I didn't know her at all. It was a Facebook friend of a Facebook friend sort of thing. We had a lot of mutual friends. And I remember just getting on that and going, wow, we are totally connected. We get each other. We dance well together. And I felt like I had known her for years.
Yeah.
And those are the ones that are always really, really special. I mean, you're one of those too. I remember the first time you and I did one, and I was like, okay, we're connected.
Yeah, thanks.
Those are the surprises. Yeah. Those are the surprises, is when you connect so well that you just don't even want it to end. And I actually recorded 3 podcasts this week for future shows, and all 3 of them were like, I didn't want them to stop.
Yeah.
Because it was about connection, which to me is at the core of this whole coming out uncloseting journey. When you can connect to yourself, and business owners, I hope you take this piece in, because it took me a long time to get this myself. The more connected I am to myself, the more connected I am to life, especially as a business owner.
Yeah, I think with the connections to yourself, the connections to your guests, kind of on this topic of podcasting, I think that's why the medium is so popular, right? Because it's this intimate journey that you have your favorite podcasts. There's probably a handful of them. But over time, you start to feel like, whoa, I really know Rick. Like, I like his philosophy on life. Or I think in this moment where we're hyper-connected digitally, but not really having real kind of meaningful, deep friendships, like this medium really kind of can fill that gap for people, kind of craving that in a culture where we're moving way too fast, I think, in my opinion. But So I feel like we can keep talking about this for a long time, and we have to go to a sponsorship break. But when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about Rick and his professional speaking. Hey, Outbosses, Rhodes Perry here. As you all know, part of my passion for this podcast is to empower you and fellow LGBT entrepreneurs to cultivate a feeling of purpose and belonging in your business. To know that you can show up and be the most authentic version of yourself. Purpose, belonging, and workplace culture are concepts I take seriously in my own consulting business. In fact, I'm on a mission to empower leaders just like you and those on their way to joining us to cultivate cultures of belonging. In my upcoming book, Belonging at Work, I share some of my personal struggles of coming out as a trans guy in the workplace and how I leverage this experience as one of my business superpowers. Now, I'm on a mission to support you in taking simple actions that will make a world of difference for anyone who has ever felt as if they needed to hide important aspects of themselves on the job. When you commit to purchasing a special, limited edition copy of the book, a portion of your purchase will support expanding workplace opportunities for fellow transgender and non-binary people. An added bonus, your story about what it means to belong at work will be featured on the book's website to inspire others. You're ready to belong at work now. To learn more, visit Rhodes on Amazon.com or text 444-999 and type the word belong. Again, that's Rhodes on Amazon.com or text 444-999 and type belong. Okay, Rick, so we're jumping back in, and I wanted to talk with you a little bit about your professional speaking and your writing journey. And my first question, so you are the author of the book, Frankly, My Dear, I'm Gay, and you were just talking a little bit earlier in the interview about how that book kind of started to gel for you as you were kind of getting into podcasting. And so I know that you're also a professional speaker, so do you define yourself as a writer who speaks or a speaker who writes? Like, what kind of came first for you?
I would say a writer. Well, no, because I was speaking at the time. I guess I would say a writer who speaks. I'm like a podcaster who speaks. And this question is so poignant, Rhodes, because the last year I've really been like, okay, it's all about speaking. It's all about speaking. It's about getting the gigs. And I learned a lot about myself in the past year around speaking. I love being on stage. I love sharing. But I'm actually a storyteller.
Yeah.
And I know that's going to throw some people like, okay, but yeah, so speakers tell stories. Yes, I realize that. But the minute I started really dialing into that, and then I looked at my podcast and I looked at what I write, everything I do is about story. And that started to make my speaking so much easier because I started saying, where can I go that people really want the story and the lessons within? And again, I know most speakers, this is what they do. But I had gotten so hung up about get a gig, solve a problem, give them a solution, that I wasn't aligned with who I was. And then there's this interesting creative side to me where, like the experience I did yesterday with the engineers, it's all about the experience. It's very experiential. And for anyone who thinks that, okay, a speaker means you stand on stage and you deliver keynotes, that's one kind of speaker. You can be a speaker who tells stories. You can be a speaker who leads workshops and facilitates. You can be a speaker who leads adventures outdoors and you have a plan, but you're still that speaker leading it. And yesterday, throughout the entire experience, when I was in my element, because this is part of what I figured out in the last year, was I'm the experiential guy who has a story that leads to learnings. And each time we stopped to do something else, I had my stories, a couple of stories ready, depending on where the teams were, to be able to bring those stories into play, to illustrate how they were in closets or how they needed to be bolder or whatever it might be. And that's how I finally figured out in the last year that I want to let my writing, my podcast, lead me to the speaking adventures. Versus I'm going to go pound out there and try to be, I don't want to be the guy who's roving all over the globe every, 4 days out of the week to speak. But I want to be speaking and I want to be doing these experiential programs.
Yeah.
And that clarity was amazing for me when I landed on it in the last 3 months.
Yeah, that resonates with me a lot, because I think you're thinking about the impact that you're having. Your lab is almost like the podcasting studio, writing blogs, writing the next book. And that's where, I mean, people, we gravitate towards storytelling. I mean, that's how for a very long time our histories have been passed down, and is that kind of oral tradition, and you're really effective at it, and I think that that's where you're probably seeing when you're up on stage and you're drawing from your experiences and sharing those stories. That's when the light bulbs go off, because people can connect more to what you're saying rather than like, here's 5 solutions on how you can be an engineering team that works better together, whatever that looks like. It's you have to go through that journey, right? And I think that takes a little bit more than just, the keynote that inspires everyone and they walk away and then they're like, wait, what do we do now? So I think that's really what you're saying definitely resonates for me. So for some folks who are tuning in, they are business owners. They are thinking about, talking about their areas of expertise as speakers. And so I was hoping you could take us back to a story, that you can share where it was in your business, your first paid speaking gig. Like what was that gig? How did it make you feel? And how did it change your mind about how to do business?
Very first one was at a high school. I wasn't sure I even wanted to do it, but I met a guy and he was the principal of the high school. And he lived in my hometown of Riverside, California at the time. And we connected and we were talking about different things about, what we do for work. And I said, hey, I'm a speaker in the podcast. Oh, really? He goes, I need somebody to come speak about, career stuff at the school. And I thought, okay, well, that's not really what I do. But I said, well, I actually do that with students in college. I talk to them about making a bold move, being who they are, and how even entering into college is the beginning of, staking your claim and moving that forward. He was like all over it. And I thought, cool. Well, I thought the gig was going to be for just juniors and seniors. And I'm like, right on, I can make this work. And then I found out about a week and a half prior that he decided to put a whole assembly together for the entire school. Now, it wasn't the number of people. That wasn't what was freaking me out. It was, okay, how do I now relate this to the freshman and sophomore? So then I'm working along with it going, okay, cool. I can kind of like take the experience of stepping into college and starting to live life on your terms and making your own choices. I'm like, I can dial this back to work with the freshman and the sophomore. We'll make that work. Then I got the curveball thrown at me. oh, by the way, we're actually going to have the sophomores and seniors together and the freshmen and the juniors together. And I'm like, great, everything just got, what I thought I had. And that was the moment I really stepped into some techniques, and some mentors' voices started lighting up my head and saying, just be in it. If you were just in it, what would you be doing? And I remember walking into the gymnasium and freaking out. I knew it was going to be there, but the acoustics were horrible. And of course, the seats are uncomfortable and all this sort of stuff for the students. And I thought, you know what? I just need to be in this. And sure enough, the first group was the freshmen and the juniors. And they weren't interested in being there whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And it was the hardest talk I've ever given, because I kept having to go quiet and not say a word. And then they would all go quiet. And then I'd keep talking. And I finally got to the point where I said, one of the things about being who you are is realizing you got to get still and you really got to think about where you're going. And I don't think you guys know where you're going, because you're sure not listening to me.
Nice.
And it got really quiet.
Yeah.
And I said, and I'm not slapping your hand like a mom or dad, but I'm giving you some information that, trust me, if I'd gotten this when I was a kid in high school, I would have listened and I would have learned. And I found it so interesting to see the reaction. And it ended up being a blessing and a curse. Because I'm never going to do this again. I decided I was never going to speak at a high school again. And then the next group came in, and they were respectful. They listened. They dialed in. And the biggest lesson I walked away with was, it's not about you, Rick. It's about them.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And when I went from the first session to the second session, I was like, Rick, really make this about the kids. And when they started to come in the gymnasium, instead of me being on the stage, I was at the doorway where they were coming in. I was high-fiving them and all this stuff. I made the connection. And that, to me, was the big lesson. You've got to connect.
I think that you've named the episode in terms of, it keeps going back to connection, right? And I think that that's so powerful for speaking in general, right? Like when you're thinking about your audience, and I know that you speak to many, many different audiences beyond high schools now, it's really getting curious, like you said earlier in the interview, around why are you being brought in? What is the need for this audience? What are they hoping to get out of it? And getting really clear on that and how you can add value for those experiences. And I give you a lot of credit for your very first paid speaking gig going into a high school, right? I just feel like that makes you super vulnerable, one, in that you're not talking to other adults. There's a different kind of brain development that's happening. And to really capture the attention of young people, that's a whole other skill on top of just the mastering the skills of public speaking in and of itself. So
yeah, and there's another piece to this that's really interesting, because now I actually also am a coach. I'm a life coach, which most people that have listened know that, but I'm also coaching now for another program. I'm actually part of Grant Baldwin's Booked and Paid to Speak team. And so I coach other speakers on, starting to get their speaking business off the ground and, getting focused on the niche and all this sort of stuff. And the first mistake most speakers make is, well, I can talk to anybody. Yeah, you can. But if you're going to go that route, you're going to have a hard time, because you need a focus.
Yeah.
And as soon as I realized that focus was so important to me and kept me in my wheelhouse, yes, I have a talk that I can put in many different places. But when I got really desperate to get speaking gigs and went many different places, I was truly all over the board, physically and mentally.
Yeah.
And as soon as I said, no, this is where I'm going to stay focused. I'm going this route. I'm going to stay here. I did a gig last year for a friend of mine who was in the hospitality industry. I did it because I'd been in that industry. We worked together. I was in the software technology stuff. And I brought my talk to that group. And it was so not where I needed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't ask all the right questions. He's like, I'd like you to do that. And I'm like, okay, this is where I'm also going to learn to say no and to ask even more questions, which goes back to my be curious thing.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good reminder where it's digging into your niche, right? I mean, there's lots of business owners who are tuning in right now and they're probably nodding their heads, yes, yes, yes. For small business owners or large business owners, whoever is listening to this right now, knowing your audience and knowing what you do to help that audience, like that's already the content that you get to work with. You're already kind of dialed in on that. And I think that's really important because then, like what you're saying, Rick, it's like you have this really great speech, this great kind of like keynote, or you can turn it into a workshop or a breakout session, whatever. It's something that you don't have to kind of customize again and again and again, which, like you said, let alone where you're traveling globally. I mean, that's just a lot of work and it's a lot of practice and refining. And so I think that really good advice on that is just kind of hone in, know your audience, and start from there, and stay focused on it.
And the other thing to it is you may start one place. When I'm coaching the current speakers on coaching, I probably coach 10 to 12 of those a week right now. We always go through this. And I'm like, here's the thing. This isn't forever. You may start. I started talking to LGBTQ individuals. But had I not started there and honed my craft and figured out my message and figured out the whole closet metaphor and making a bold move and living life on your terms, I wouldn't actually be doing what I'm doing right now. But it was because I was focused, and a mutual friend of ours, Dory Clark, she was one who said this to me. She said, Rick, go narrow and deep and then go wide.
Yeah. Yep.
Some of the best advice I've ever got. And I encourage anybody, whether you're looking to become a podcaster, a speaker, or run a business, take that advice in. The more niche focused you are, the more successful you will be.
Yes. The riches are in the niches, right? And I love that you mentioned Dory Clark, who author of Entrepreneurial You. We've had her on the show before, and she's brilliant, super brilliant. I wanted to talk with you about a topic that lights both of us up, which is all about masculinity. And I know that you're digging into this a lot with the work that you're doing. So I guess to frame the conversation, just for folks who may need more of a primer on what we're talking about, can you just start us off by sharing kind of your working definition of toxic masculinity, which is in the news a lot, kind of juxtaposed next to the Me Too movement, and then how you define healthy masculinity?
So to me, toxic masculinity is really that element of, because I'm a man, I can get away with this. And that can be everything from privilege to superiority to gender to sexuality, any of those things. It can be even toxic that, because I went to college and I got a degree, that makes me more of a man than you, who's never done any of that, and you're a blue-collar guy. Anything that turns somebody else into something less than, just because you believe your manhood gives you the right to be that way, to me, it's very toxic. And I know there have been times in my life that and even present day, there are times that I let my toxic masculinity show up, and then I kick myself in the ass and say, wait, you're not walking your walk and talking your talk. And it's a daily sort of exploration to see where I can find this, not only in myself, because the more I can identify it in myself, the better I can be at helping others see it in themselves and repair what's been done. I grew up in a very kind of toxic masculine home. I see it clearly even to this day. For me, the opposite is a guy who's not toxic is compassionate, is empathetic, is curious, is willing to say, I don't have the answer, is willing to say, teach me. Is someone who says, I'll be better by you showing me what better looks like. It's really about dropping the mask and stepping forward into, this is who I really want to be, and I don't really care what someone else thinks. Now, that can go south, but what I'm getting at is, this is who I really want to be, because I'm going to break the mold of what people tell me a man is supposed to be, and I'm going to be the man I want to be. And to me, that's healthy masculinity.
Thank you for defining healthy masculinity in particular, because I think that there is a lot of conversation around the problems of toxic masculinity And I like the way that you define that too. Because I'm a man, I can get away with it. This idea of one-upsmanship and how that is toxic amongst men, amongst masculine identified people, and it's pretty negative. And I think, like you said, growing up, kind of your own personal experiences, but also in the society that we're in, we swim in it every day. And to kind of do the work that you're doing where you're proactively disrupting it and having to challenge yourself on a day-to-day basis definitely resonates a lot with me. As you were going through the traits of a healthy masculinity model, it's interesting because as you're naming things like compassion, empathetic, curious, in the book that I just wrote, I write about inclusive leadership. And this similar traits are what makes an inclusive leader. And, it's just like, oh, right. Because we swim in toxic masculinity, it's no wonder that we struggle as organizations to create healthy workplace cultures, So the work that you're doing is really powerful, and just sharing this kind of general knowledge, in terms of these models of masculinity, how are you specifically using it in your work?
Well, it's interesting because I realized the coming out journey is a toxic masculinity result. The fact that we have to be in a closet is because of a masculine energy that says you're different, so you don't exist, or you're different, so you're not as worthy. This started to happen for me in the last year because I realized I was getting back to my roots. I'd been like, okay, I want to do all these other things, but as soon as I landed on the bold move and the living your life on your terms, and, of course, I already had the Life Uncloseted podcast brand going, I want to do this work with the people who mean the most. And then I thought, oh, it's guys over 40, Well, who are the guys that mostly are getting beat up about this whole toxic masculinity thing? Well, probably guys over 40 because they're either baby boomers, Gen Xers, they kind of are in the midst of this. Not saying that millennials don't have it too, but, we kind of are the ones who got bred into this kind of a world. So if I can help break this, and I can use what I'm doing with all my different metaphors of closet busting or whatever it might be, what difference can that make in the world? Because here's what I know. I know this as much as I know that I'm a bald guy. I know that men have the capacity to be vulnerable. I know men have the capacity to be transparent, to be empathetic, to be compassionate. I also know that we as a society need to own that we have not allowed men to go there without a struggle. And the sooner we allow it to happen with ease, the sooner toxic masculinity will begin to diminish. And I think this is that important piece because I think there gets a lot of guys get thrown in to the arena, the abyss of toxic masculinity. And it wasn't until I was having a conversation with a university recently that I'm probably going to speak at this spring. The event planner, young gal, she's like a senior in college. She's planning the event. And she goes, I just want to make sure, Rick, that when you do this talk and then you go into the workshop, that you make it clear that we're on the guy's side. We don't think all guys are toxic. We think the behavior is. And I said, I'm so glad you said that because that tells me you get it, that you truly get it. And I think this is something that we all need to embrace because there can be toxic femininity. There can be toxic Democrats. There can be toxic Republicans. There can be toxic Black people, Chinese people. I don't care who you are. We can be toxic human beings. So let's take the toxic out of the label masculinity and ask yourselves, am I being a toxic human?
Yeah, I think that, I'm taking in what you're saying, and this work that you're doing, and centering around masculinity in this case, and going to universities and really connecting with people who identify with some aspect of masculinity, regardless of their gender, right? That I think that this work is liberation work in some ways, because, and this is just me and my experience of being a trans person. I joked around when I was younger, and it's just kind of like this idea of gender jail, where it's like we are assigned the sexes at birth, right? Whether or not we identify with them
Right.
now. And there are these prescriptive rules that come along with the gender, whether you want them or
Yep.
not. And I
Mm-hmm.
think with men in particular, and I'm a trans guy, so just let me know if I'm not in alignment with kind of the cis guy experience. But I do think that there's just such a limited range in how to be a man that won't be policed, right? And I think that's where,
Mm-hmm.
at least I've seen kind of toxic masculinity. And as a trans person, I'm just like, whatever, I'm going to, I already was assigned these gender roles as a younger person. They didn't work for me. So I'm going to
Yep.
kind of create my own and just dive into the sphere and figure out what works best. But I do think like, without that experience, for a lot of cis guys, maybe particularly straight cis guys, I'd love to hear from people if they have opinions on this. But it's just, without that permission to explore, gender and express it in a way that feels authentic to you, man, like that's gotta suck, So I feel like
Mm-hmm.
with what you're doing, you can really connect with guys who may not have had permission to explore this,
Mm-hmm.
For folks who aren't tuning in, like, Rick, when I see you, I think like you are a man's man, So I feel like what people may make assumptions of seeing you come on stage of like, this guy's going to talk about masculinity and about how to be a man. And there's you have kind of this kind of alpha energy, that I sense. And then you're giving permission to people, to other guys to just start talking about this. I think that helps change people's minds. Like, I feel like you're
Mm-hmm.
one of the right messengers, I think, in these
Mm-hmm.
spaces. So I'm giving you lots of compliments. I hope that you're receiving it that way, because I do think
I
that,
am, and it's a blessing because I sometimes forget that. I just go do my thing, and I love what I do. But as you were sitting here, I was first getting chills, but then I put it into an appreciation space of let's really take this in, because I don't typically take compliments in like I should.
yeah,
And again, it's part of my masculine DNA.
yeah,
And as you were saying that about, you come on stage and you project this image of masculinity, and it's true. And then suddenly I go, okay, girls, here's what we're going to do today.
nice.
And then suddenly like, oh my
Everyone's
God,
like,
this
what?
big guy just like went, what? What
Yeah.
just happened here?
Yep.
But it is an interesting juxtaposition, and, kind of back to using your voice when you can really tap into, and again, business owners, please, 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 I hope you really hear this. When you can really tap into every essence of what you are and who you are meant to be in the world, you will find these connections that you would have never thought of to use. When I tapped into, I'm a big guy, as Rose says, I'm 6'4", I'm about 290 pounds, and I'm not muscle. I'm just a big, stocky guy. So there's immediately an assumption that happens most of the time when I walk into any room or into anything. And that doesn't mean I turn on the gay, but what I do is I suddenly start to connect with people from a place of, I see you, you see me, and I'm going to be really transparent. And a lot of people are shocked at how transparent I will be. And I'm like, that's okay. That's just how I show up in the world. Find how you truly can show up in the world. Leverage that every day in every way. Because if the world isn't seeing you in that manner, well, you're doing yourself an injustice, and you're actually doing the world an injustice as well.
Wow. This is so powerful, and I love this conversation. And, normally we do a bonus round, and I want to ask you one more question, which I feel like will kind of round out the interview. And we were talking about this before the interview, which is at the time of this recording, early in 2019, the Supreme Court just kind of made a ruling that allows the trans military ban to basically move forward. I'm not a legal expert here on all the details of that, but it's bad. And so when we were talking, Rick, you had mentioned, the trans military ban is an example of toxic masculinity. So just kind of like Cliff Notes version, like, can you elaborate a little bit more on that? And maybe, something to give our listeners something to take away from this interview of like how to be proactive or how to show up and support to kind of disrupt this toxic masculinity.
So I guess the easiest way to do it is, I just wrote an article about this, and actually I just recorded a podcast about this, is to simply walk you through a moment. I want you to imagine that you were walking down the street And as you came to a corner, a car lost control and it hit you. And you're laying there on the sidewalk and you're bleeding out. And the person that comes up to you says, I can help you. I've been trained in CPR, or I'm a nurse, or happen to be a doctor. In that moment, are you going to ask them if they're a Christian? In that moment, are you going to ask them if they're a Republican or a Democrat? In that moment, are you going to ask them if they've ever committed adultery? In that moment, are you literally going to ask them, if it's a man, do you have a penis or a vagina? The answer is probably no, 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 and no. Because you're going to see that person as a human. And you're going to see that person as someone who's caring and compassionate towards you because they don't want to see you die. And you look at them and you're grateful and you're thankful that they showed up because you don't want to die. And when we have toxic masculinity that says you're only capable of doing something because of the genitals between your legs, or an assumption because you don't have those genitals, or you've had those genitals added because of who you know in your heart, but that doesn't fit the mold of what a man's supposed to be or what a woman's supposed to be. But when we allow this kind of toxic masculinity to enter into the world, you might as well have just died on that street corner because you asked the question, are you a transgender person? And if so, I'd rather die than have you touch me. Mm-hmm. To me, this is what the essence of any toxicity is about. Is when we take someone simply because of who they are and how they show up in the world and say, you're less than me. But yet in the worst moments in life, would you really, truly reject their help?
That is a very powerful way of just building empathy, Rick. So I thank you for taking us through that exercise, that visualization. I think it's really powerful and it puts things in perspective. And, for folks that aren't a part of our rainbow family and aren't necessarily super connected with trans folks like me, non-binary folks, it can be probably easy to dehumanize a group of people you've never met before. So I thank you for that. I thank you for the writing that you do. I thank you for the speaking that you do. I thank you for changing people's minds about masculinity and giving healthy models for that. And I encourage you to keep doing that work because we need it. So for folks who are tuning in, I encourage you to check out the show notes. We're going to have every single way that you can connect with Rick there. And Rick, thank you for making time for today. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, and I feel like we can keep talking all day. So for our listeners, thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. It's always a privilege to connect with you and super inspiring outbosses like Rick. So for details from today's conversation, go ahead and check out show notes at outentrepreneur.com, or you can text OUTBOSS, all one word, to 444-999, and we will connect you directly with all the content from today's show. As a next step, subscribe to the podcast, consider leaving a rating and review in iTunes, and be sure to share this episode with a friend or a loved one. And as always, keep being your authentic selves 100% of the time.